Join us now on Flickr at flickr.com/groups/art of photography. Okay, classic dilemma. You're shooting outside on a bright sunny day and you have a problem. You're shooting something and you're starting to lose all the detail in the shadows. So you adjust your exposure a little bit. The next thing you know, all the highlights are blowing out and you have these big blotches of white in your photograph. Well, what are you to do? Well, welcome to the Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes and today we're going to talk about dynamic range. Now, what is dynamic range? Well, dynamic range is simply the range of light that you can reproduce in a photograph. Now, there's a big difference between the human eye and your camera. Human eye can see much more light than what you end up seeing either on a computer screen or in a photograph. And so what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about this business of being a photographer and learning how to wrangle light to do what you need it to do. And there's basically two ways you can do this. With black and white photography, you can affect your development. With digital and color photography, there's some post-processing you can do. So let's go over to Photoshop for a second and let's look at restoring some shadows and highlights. Okay, I've got Photoshop open here, and what we're looking at is just a grayscale that I created. And I want to talk about this. We've talked about this in podcasts before. And Ansel Adams, who was a very well-known fine art photographer, dealt with a lot of landscapes in the 40s and 50s, developed a system that he taught called the zone system. And basically what you have is in a black and white photograph, and we're going to move to color in a second, and obviously Ansel shot on film. This is pre-digital. But you have a series of 10 zones here, okay? And zone 1 being pure black and zone 10 being pure white. And then you have the zones and the gray scales that fall between. And essentially, Ansel basically, when you look at a photograph, it should be presented within these 10 zones here. And your tonality of the photograph would be spread evenly between these zones. Now, we're not going to get heavily into zone system here, but the challenge in this as a photographer is manipulating the lighting conditions that you're shooting in. So if you're in a high contrast situation, so for instance, if you're outside on a really bright sunny day, you're going to have really intense highlights, reflections off of metal, things like that, maybe clouds in the sky, and your shadows are going to be completely on the other end of the spectrum. They may be really dark. Now, the human eye can actually see about 24 zones of light, okay, or 24 stops. So it's a pretty high range. And most photographs, and when I say photographs, we're dealing with a wide range of stuff here, it's a lot less. So for instance, print film or color negative film captures about 7 stops of light. Slide film or chromes capture about 5 stops of light, so they're really narrow. And then on the digital end of things, you are dealing with, you're kind of at the mercy of your analog to digital converter in your camera. So really nice digital cameras, or the more expensive ones, will capture more stops of light. Some of the high-end Canons capture 11, 12, somewhere in there. Now, black and white film, you can actually control this, and that's what Ansel was teaching with the zone system. If you know how to place zones in specific areas of your photograph with a light meter, you can adjust the development time to either create more contrast or decrease contrast. And we'll get into that later, but basically I want to show you how we can apply this to film images and digital images alike. So see, you have your 10 zones here, and we'll bring up a photograph here. This is one of my photographs, and this actually, I used the zone system here to manipulate this. This rose was taken in fairly low contrast light, but I did want a high contrast. So you can see that I have managed to place my extreme darks right here in the shadows, which kind of go to almost pure black, and then the highlights tend to blow out right here on the edge of this flower, and it creates a dramatic dynamic range within this flower. It's not really as you would see it when I was taking the photo, but I manipulated to get that. And we'll do some more stuff on zone system later. But back to the initial question here. I have another image here. Let's turn these off. This was not a spectacular image, but it was taken on opening day baseball a few years ago, and this was late morning, and it was extremely high contrast light, as you can see. And this is a scan of the slide, but you can see that you lose all kinds of detail here in the shadows. Okay, it's just not there, and that's what happens is when in your photograph on the low end of things, when things start to go too dark. Let's go back and look at the grayscale. Ansel always implied that zone 3 was where you first start to see texture. Okay, so you're going to lose detail in images when they go below zone 3, and consequently they're going to start to blow out once you hit about zone 7. That's the last zone where you're going to see detail, and obviously it just starts to look like blown highlights at that point. So let's go back over here. So what can you do if you've already taken the image, or let's say you shot with a digital camera and you just end up with a real contrasty image like this? Well, how can you control it? If you have a low contrast image, you can obviously manipulate levels and curves and things like that. But what do you do when you're already kind of maxed out? You can see these highlights in the clouds. You just lose them. They just go kind of this bluish light color. And then obviously in the backstop and the shadows. Well, if you're working in Photoshop or Aperture or Lightroom or any of these programs, there is some control that you have. Now, if you've taken this with a digital camera, obviously the better your AD converters, as we said, are going to come into play here. But what we're doing is we're basically taking what light was seen in the actual scene and we're squeezing it down into what is it can be displayed either on a computer screen, a printout, things like that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up under the image menu at the top of the screen, and we're going to go to, actually let me select that layer. Let's go to Image. We're going to go down here to Adjustments, which is the second one down, and I'm going to go down and select Shadow Highlight. And it's going to bring up this box here for shadows and highlights, and I'm going to turn the amount down so you can see what I'm dealing with. Okay, scale out here. Now in the photograph, I want you to watch what happens when I turn this amount up in the shadows. What it's going to do is it's going to start brightening up the shadows as I pull this up, and if I pull it way up, you can see that it brought out a lot of detail. My photo looks really strange now and kind of washed out. So you would want to split this difference. So basically, you know, naturally these are shadows. I just want to get some more detail back. So I can tweak that amount to get some of my detail back, and we will adjust the tonal width here too, and that's basically, you know, how wide that low end range is right there, and you can also adjust the radius. Now on the other end of things, you can also bring back the highlights. So if I turn the amount up on the highlights, it starts reducing the highlights, and look what happens in the cloud. So here it is pure unaffected, and then as I start affecting it, it does bring the highlights down somewhat. The other thing you can do is adjustments. There's color correction because your colors can get a little wonky in here, and there's also mid-tone contrast. So if you're starting to get kind of a strange haze to this, you can adjust the mid-tone contrast, either bring it back or down. And so here I still have a fairly contrasty image, but I was able to bring back a lot of that detail in these heavy shadow areas, and also some detail in these clouds that was starting to blow out. Now if I toggle the preview on and off, you can see the before and after on the image, and I was able to kind of bring some of that down and back. And so this is the way you would kind of manipulate it. Also, I got a lot more saturation in this blue sky, which is kind of interesting too, but this is the way you would manipulate it in the computer on that end of things. And so, you know, a lot of times at digital cameras, you're at the mercy of what's being taken, just like you are with slide color film. Black and white, there are ways to manipulate the development where you can really get a lot of control, but of course you're not in color. So anyway, all this to say, as I said earlier, especially with digital images, you're at the mercy of the analog digital conversion. And actually on this slide film, the slide film was definitely the bottleneck of this, but you know, the scanner has analog to digital conversion too. And so anyway, so that's one thing you can kind of do. Another thing you could do, and this image is probably not a good example, but if you're shooting something that's a little more close up, you can use a fill flash. And basically all that means is shoot with your flash in the daylight. And so you would turn on your flash, and what it's going to do is it's just going to brighten up some of the shadow areas too. Like if I used a fill flash here, this girl's shirt probably would have been brightened up, and some of the seats in the front, and that's a really nice nice kind of way you can affect the contrast. So really what this is about is taking, you know, what you see in real life, which is, you know, like I said before, up to 24 stops of light, and bringing it down, and translating that into a very limited dynamic range. And if you have a really nice digital camera, you might get up to 12 stops of light, but that's still half of what your eye is seeing. And you know, it takes some tweaking and manipulation, but anyway, contrast days are just hard to do, and probably what your best bet is to take this into Photoshop or Aperture or Lightroom and work with it from there. So anyway, I hope this helps kind of explain dynamic range a little bit. There's also HDR images, which we'll go into another time, where you can actually, there are some severe limitations, but what you would do is actually set your tripod up and take up to 5 exposures, or sometimes more, at various exposures on your camera, which your meter comes to, and you would combine these in Photoshop and come up with a high dynamic range image. But we'll talk about that another time too. So anyway, this has been The Art of Photography. Thanks for watching.